Welcome to News from Neptune for March 29th in the 13th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." That begins by calling things by their right names, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. He's talking, of course, about the capitalism analyzed by Marx in the middle of the 19th century. Every industrial society today, says Chomsky, is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't mean that state capitalist regimes haven't made substantial progress in the 20th century, Russia and China notably, but it does mean that our belated discussion these days about socialism and capitalism is remarkably jejune. We have a great deal more to say about that, and in a serious political discussion, we would be saying it. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Boys of Summer edition of News from Neptune. Poet wrote, "Damn everything but the circus." I would substitute baseball, perhaps, and the season opened this week. David's team won their opener handily. Mine lost badly. But there's another game today. I wish we could be as sure about politics. Our friends at Counterpunch note this morning, a snotty little note arrived in the Counterpunch inbox this morning, chiding us for talking about opening day. This loathsome correspondent said sports are a distraction from the really important matters of the day. Doesn't this cretin know that the Mueller report is a distraction from baseball? Seems to me right. David, do you think it's true that when the one great scorer comes to mark against your name, he writes not whether you won or lost, but how you played the game?
I'm not sure which way I would be better off, but
Huh?
But The Boys of Summer refers to a book by a man named Roger Kahn,
Right.
who was the corresponding who covered a journalist who covered the Brooklyn Dodgers in the early 1950s, and I think he wrote this book about the seasons of 1952 and 53, if I recall correctly. Both of which in which both seasons the Dodgers were defeated in the World Series by the hated New York Yankees. But
Evil triumphs once again.
what makes the story poignant, of course, or in many ways, is that it seems like a relatively simple time in the history of this country when baseball players lived in rooming houses in the cities that they played in, and walked to the ballpark, but also it's made this book, The Boys of Summer, is made sort of a historical document by the fact that it details the relationship between Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese, the first black player in Major League Baseball, and his of course he was a second baseman. Pee Wee Reese was a shortstop and from the South, and their relationship evolved in poignant ways after Jackie Robinson coming to the big leagues in 1948.
The conditions you describe of baseball in the early 20th century were going to change quite remarkably, as a matter of fact. There was quite a scandal, if that's the word, in the sports press when Babe Ruth, at the height of his career, had a contract that gave him more money than the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. And he was asked by reporters, do you think it's right that you get paid more than the President? And Ruth shrugged and said, I had a better year than he did. And that was certainly true.
Absolutely. That's when capitalism was still capitalism, on its downside.
Well,
its downside during the
downside of the Great Depression.
During the Hoover years.
Yeah,
yes.
during the Hoover years.
Yeah, but yeah. Anyway, speaking of capitalism,
as we were.
I was going to segue into a long postponed discussion on this program. It may not be long, but still I wanted to mention it, of modern monetary theory. I think I started talking about modern MMT, modern monetary theory, on this program probably 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think so.
And I did it because as Chomsky says, it's good to be puzzled by things. And when one is puzzled by money and who has it and who doesn't have it, and why there isn't enough of it, why it is that people, when there are resources to be worked upon and skilled labor to work upon those resources, why it is that people aren't actually employed at gainful jobs. And when you start asking those questions, you start looking at the people who, among other things, advocate modern monetary theory, which over these last years has become increasingly visible in the public eye, and therefore increasingly criticized in the mainstream media. Not only in the mainstream media, but we see someone like George Will feeling like he has to devote an entire column towards kind of satirizing the idea that you can just print money. Modern monetary theory, henceforth MMT, can't be reduced to the simple idea that the government can print money, but it's based in the idea that we have a state currency, not a gold-based currency, and that currency can be used primarily from the MMT perspective within capitalism to put people to work. It's not the only thing that they say. It's been criticized by people from the so-called right of modern monetary theory, like Paul Krugman. It's been criticized by George Will. It's also been criticized by Marxist economists, like there's a British Marxist economist named Michael Roberts, who has a very good blog in which he devoted 3 long articles to, I think, helpfully critiquing MMT from a Marxist point of view, meaning that from the left, unless you address capitalism, unless you address certain fundamental aspects of capitalism, MMT will fail in the long run, like every other effort to sort of fix capitalism or save capitalism. As it so happens, just this morning, this has been happening in rapid order. Just this morning, and a guy who writes regularly on Counterpunch very well, Rob Urie, U-R-I-E, writes, "The Green New Deal first shoot the economists," and then he says throughout the article, I don't really mean that literally; it's a metaphor. But what he writes here, to summarize, is, quote, "MMT is useful in that it provides options. Either 1, the rich can be made to pay for a Green New Deal. 2, the federal government can fund it, or some combination thereof. In any of these cases, the problem with not politically sidelining the rich is that their wealth and political power comes from environmental destruction. Even if they wrangled out of paying for the transition and cleanup, the survival of the planet depends on shutting down the source of their wealth and power. The liberal theory that this could be achieved through electoral politics usually proceeds from radically understating the problem. Given given the relationship of capitalist economic theories to potentially world-ending environmental crisis, capitalist economists have little to offer related to a Green New Deal. In defense of their realm, their practice has been to serially understate environmental problems and then offer the same canned ideology they were indoctrinated with decades ago as cautionary tales. The question for a Green New Deal should be, what is needed to transition from the environmentally apocalyptic path we are on to long-term sustainability, while ensuring that everyone, every last person, has their material and social needs met. Again, please do not shoot the economists. Love them for their humanity. The title is a metaphor. So this adds on to the ongoing debate that we find in which modern monetary theory, the idea that the question of how do we pay for social programs is a misguided question. The question is, do we have the resources and the labor to actually implement these programs? And in the context of the Green New Deal, the question is, how can we not do this given the urgency of climate change?
I was shocked this week to hear that Potemkin village of a politician, Obama, step forward and say, well, look, all these suggestions like the Green New Deal are nice, but how will we ever be able to afford them? Now,
He said that?
He said that
Yeah.
in so many words, and
my goodness.
incredible. It really is. I mean, he's been from the beginning, as we've argued here, a false front for the most reactionary policies of the presidency and all the previous administrations, neoliberal and neoconservative. But it's interesting to hear him as he dines out on his celebrity, saying these things, which are so remarkably destructive in the way that you discuss. Of course, we all remember how the 8 wars and the war provocations against Russia and China of the Obama administration were always prefaced by Obama saying, how are we going to pay for it?
Yep.
How are we going to pay for the ongoing war in Afghanistan? How are we going to pay for invading the South China Sea? How are we going to pay for sending NATO to the eastern border?
Or bailing out the banks in 2008.
Exactly, right. Yeah. But now, when this gentle and largely inchoate Green New Deal steps forward, suddenly it's far too expensive for us to do anything about it. That's the real point, it seems to me, of modern monetary theory. A lot of it can be argued about.
Yeah.
But the point, I mean, in some ways, it's best summarized by the mantra from the second Bush administration, where turned up, by the way, in the wonderful film Vice about the President Dick Cheney, the notion that deficits don't matter was attributed to the Reagan years, and there is a germ of truth in that. And the germ of truth is reflected by the attempts of modern monetary theory to give an account of essentially why deficits don't matter. The independent economist Doug Henwood, a friend of this ground, has published a long and interesting attack on modern monetary theory this month. And if we want to get into the subject in its essence, we should pay attention to that. It's the political aspect that's much more important, I think, finally, when we have Obama going around saying things like this, which are simply hortatory defenses of capitalist profits. And it's capitalism that is the issue, as
What
you're just pointing out.
What modern monetary theories claim that they are doing, and I think they're right about this, is they're just simply describing the way money. They're telling us where money comes from, and it comes from the government. It comes from the Federal Reserve. It doesn't come from the ground or grow on trees, and they're simply describing how money is entered into our system, how it is entered out of our system, what the relationship is between between spending, which comes first, and taxes, spending at the federal level, which comes first, and taxes, which come later, or spending at the banking level. When you borrow money, money comes into being. That money isn't in your bank. That the money that you get when you buy a car or whatever is not in the reserves of the bank itself. It's not a result of people making deposits into the bank. So you get involved in these theories, but they're just simply they're simply describing how money works. Doug Henwood's article was on the Jacobin website, and the responses to it, the easiest place to find responses to it, are on the Naked Capitalism website, which has been pretty much devoted towards supporting modern monetary theory for the last several years, and it's published responses not just to Henwood, but to Paul Krugman and other people like that, by people that you see in other places, like on the Real News Network, like Bill Black, and one of the primary proponents of MMT, which is a guy named Randall Wray, W-R-A-Y, who has an article up just in the last couple of days, I think, on the Naked Capitalism website. So the rather technical involved debate is something I dive about 1/3 into, not all the way into, but it's still important for people to understand that the basics are perfectly understandable can be made perfectly understandable to lay persons.
There's a direct local relationship to this that you can read about in Jim Dye's column in this morning's News Gazette.
Yeah.
Dye, the opinions editor for the News Gazette, has been on a campaign against the new governor's suggestion that we need a graduated income tax in the state and a progressive income tax, a tax that would tax those with greater income more than those with lesser income, a greater percentage on the income of the wealthy than of the poor. That's forbidden by the Illinois state constitution, and any attempt to do that will require an amendment to the constitution, not out of the question, but a good ways off. I've suggested for a while that the important insight about contemporary capitalism comes from a book by Thomas Piketty, which is much more readable than its critics suggest, Capital in the 21st Century. What Piketty says in essence, and I'm summarizing a 700-page book here, what Piketty says in interest is that you've got to tax wealth, not income. Taxing income really doesn't get you very far. He does point out some interesting things in the history of taxing income about how the exorbitant corporate salaries, executive salaries we see in the U.S. right now are really a response of lowering the progressive rates of income that existed as recently as the Reagan administration. But the point he wants to insist upon is that there is a tendency under capitalism for wealth to accumulate in fewer and fewer hands. That tendency is long-term and structural, he says. It's built into the system. Now, in fact, what we've seen over 40 years of what we've called neoliberalism, the economic policies of the United States since the 1970s, is a rapid and accelerating concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. A greater concentration, a concentration that is increasing over time, and even the rate of the concentration is increasing over time. The second derivative is positive, if you remember your high school math. The notion here is that we should be taxing not income. The low flat tax on income called for a while ago by the Tea Party is essentially correct. We should be taxing wealth. There is the ability to pay, and there is the only possible way to turn back this immense concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. The way to tax wealth is a little more difficult, but there is one obvious way right in front of us. It's been talked about a long time, attributed to the Yale economist James Tobin, and therefore called a Tobin tax, and that's a sales tax on financial transactions. When you go to the grocery store, you pay a sales tax on most of the items you buy, but when you go to see your broker, you don't pay a sales tax on the financial instruments that you buy. Tobin simply pointed out this was crazy. A low tax, a tiny tax on financial transaction would produce an immense amount of money for states and government, for state and national government, and the financial crisis that has become a matter of course in Illinois could be handled by such a thing. So it actually has been suggested in various places by in the state of Illinois under the name of a LaSalle Street tax. LaSalle Street being the Wall Street of Chicago, a LaSalle Street tax, a tax on financial transactions, could solve the state's financial problems. But there are obviously some people who don't want it, mainly the people who control those large amounts of money.
Probably even J.B. Pritzker himself, Governor Pritzker.
Well, and in fact, that was played out in the gubernatorial, in the primaries for the governor's race, when another candidate, a candidate who did not become another aspirant to the Democratic nomination, did not become the Democratic candidate, suggested that the solution to Illinois' tax problem, Illinois' financial problems, was a financial transactions tax. That was mentioned in the campaign. It disappeared rather quickly, and the person who suggested it, a member of the legislature, is no longer a member of the legislature, but he did become a supporter of J.B. Pritzker without getting any sort of commitment from Pritzker to the point that he had been making, the need for a financial transactions tax. There's been a bill in every recent Illinois legislature to establish such a tax. It has a few supporters, but no success. Not surprising.
And how, but still kind of interesting given that the Democrats have a super majority in both the Illinois Senate and Illinois House, so the Democratic Party, the supposedly liberal party, could do whatever it wants in that regard. But we all know what that means in terms of whose interests the Democrats actually represent, even in blue states.
Unfortunately true. You are watching News from Neptune. We're talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. We have a note from our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson, on the Democratic candidates. We need another word because, of course, they're not candidates yet, but the hopefuls for the Democratic presidential nomination, and the question of war. You would think that after the last several administrations, which had been remarkably belligerent and warlike, the issue of war would figure more prominently in the discussion of who should be the next Democratic candidate for president, but it doesn't. That it's mentioned at all is a result of outsiders like Tulsi Gabbard and the position of the progressive hero for the Democrats, Bernie Sanders, has been at best ambiguous on this matter. Code Pink, the anti-war group, has addressed the matter recently, and they write as follows: Senator Sanders has the best voting record of any candidate on war and peace issues, especially on military spending. You can hear the whistling in the dark in the background if you want, but they may be right. Unfortunately, they're right that he does have the best record. That means the other records are pretty bad, and the overall record is bad. Opposing the oversized Pentagon budget, Sanders has only voted for 3 out of 19 military spending bills since 2013. Well, that seems to have been enough for the Pentagon, but still. By this measure, no other candidate comes close, including Tulsi Gabbard. In other votes on war and peace, Sanders voted as requested by Peace Action 84% of the time from 2011 to 2016, despite some hawkish votes on Iran from 2011 to 2013. Well, one major Code Pink is trying to make the best case they can for Sanders' absent opposition to the wars of the Obama administration. One major contradiction in Sanders' opposition to out-of-control military spending has been his support for the world's most expensive and wasteful weapon system, the trillion-dollar F-35 fighter jet. Not only does Sanders support the F-35, he pushed, despite local opposition, to get these fighter jets stationed at the Burlington airport for the Vermont National Guard. Bernie Sanders was senator from Vermont. He is senator from Vermont. Keep in mind that of the candidates Code Pink reviewed, Sanders is the least supportive of the belligerency. It only gets more pro-war as you go down Code Pink's list, and Sanders rightfully received criticism for his support for militarism in 2016. I believe part of the criticism came from what he told Meet the Press in those days. He was asked, "What does counterterrorism look like in a Sanders administration? Drones, special forces, or what does it look like?" Now, remember, the assumption of this is that American wars are counterterrorism. You know, the idea that American wars are imperialist crimes was not part of the discussion. That's outside the limits of allowable debate. But here, at least, they're talking about the counterterrorism that is the label pasted on these American wars. And Sanders is asked, what does counterterrorism look like in a Bernie Sanders administration? His answer is, all of that and more. That is, drones, special forces, etc. All of that and more, says Sanders. He's asked, you're okay with the drone, using drones? Sanders breaks in, look, drone is a weapon. When it works badly, it is terrible and it is counterproductive. When you blow up a facility or a building which kills women and children, you know what? Not only doesn't do us any good, it's terrible. He's asked, but you're comfortable with the idea of using drones if you think you've isolated an important terrorist? Sanders, yes. Todd says, so that continues? Sanders, yes. Our comment from our researcher is, I don't agree with all of Code Pink's 10 points in their 10 peace positions for presidential candidates. For example, point 8 is promote women in peacemaking, which strikes me as sexist, identity politics driven, belied by recent history. You don't have to mention everyone from Mrs. Thatcher to Indira Gandhi, but still, belied by recent history and not in keeping with the fact-based analysis of a candidate's political history, as shown in their own candidate review in the same article. But I think Code Pink has some valid choices in the list as well, notably Tulsi Gabbard, and we'll have more to say about that. So Sanders is not the hero of the anti-war movement, but then no other Democrats are either, huh?
Yeah. There was a fellow who died in the last week or so named Rafi Eitan, E-I-T-A-N, who was responsible for procuring Adolf Eichmann
Yes.
back in the early 1960s for kidnapping him, basically, kidnapping a Nazi war criminal, and resulting which was, of course, the famous Eichmann trial and the famous books about the Eichmann trial, most notably Hannah Arendt, and all the controversy that's surrounded that. One of the pieces about the late Rafi Eitan, who, by the way, isn't to be confused with another fellow named Raphael Eitan, who is a more well-known Israeli defense person or offense person. But this Rafi Eitan is quoted in the New York Times in relation to his Mossad work, his work in sort of, as you say, anti-terror work. And he's quoted as having said, in principle, when there is a war on terror, you conduct it without principles. Mr. Eitan said in an interview with the Israeli newspaper Haaretz in 2010. You simply fight it. So that kind of jumped out at me as sort of characterizing the amoral mentality, the sort of the casual manner in which an amoral mentality can be put forth when people are so convinced by the moral rectitude of their cause, of their state, of their country, of their nation, and that's what it sort of comes down to when you look at the operations of our own military or Israel's military or their sort of international, their version of the CIA. It just gets worse and worse as you go deeper and deeper into that.
You're also going to look at murderers in Christchurch, New Zealand, who have essentially the same view.
Yeah, right.
There are a number of things to go to here.
Yeah.
The drone assassination programs that all the Democratic candidates are down with one way or another, was called quite rightly by Noam Chomsky the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen. He was referring to Obama's Terror Tuesdays when they picked people around the world, when he picked people around the world from baseball cards John Brennan proposed for him. He picked people to be murdered by drones around the world. I thought one of the more interesting comments on this was Hillary Clinton's when the question of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks came up while she was Secretary of State, and she is reported reliably to have said, "Can't we drone him?" This is, in other words, a tool of government in the Obama-Clinton administration, a tool that unfortunately the Trump administration has been willing to take up and use around the world, even though the awful John Brennan has been shown the door at the CIA and even from the security clearances that allowed him to choose the people to kill or to help Obama choose the people to kill in the greatest terrorist campaign the world has yet seen. So these are real issues, important issues. Last week I was talking about some popular anti-drone campaigns carried on across the country, including invasion of army bases by peace demonstrators, where the bases were the source of a good bit of the drone warfare, the drone assassinations that the last administration and this one are carrying out. It's a question we should be talking about, and when we realize that on the same day 50 people are killed in a mosque in New Zealand by a terrorist gunman, the United States by air killed 50 people and more perhaps in a mosque and simply announced that it was an attack on an al-Qaeda meeting. No evidence of such a thing was forthcoming, but the whole notion that one can blow away 50 people in a mosque because of the terrorism they're thinking of was, of course, the rationale of the manifesto put forward by the Christchurch murderer, a manifesto, by the way, that has been banned in New Zealand and apparently some places as well. You can be thrown in jail for years for possessing a copy of this screed that was placed on the internet and in New Zealand. And this is quite remarkable. I mean, the willingness of governments to violate their own principles on free speech under the justification of counterterrorism is pretty remarkable and, how shall we say it, a bit disingenuous.
Yes.
You're watching news from Neptune. We have much more, unfortunately, to talk about.
Just in passing, perhaps, let me mention the Golan Heights. And when I arrived,
we've just passed them on to somebody else.
Yeah,
right.
When I arrived at a kibbutz in northern Israel, in almost exactly 45 years ago, in 1974, At which point in time it had been a few months since the October War of '73, and it had been almost 7 years since the '67 war, in which the Golan Heights had been occupied by Israel, which it has been occupied ever since, even though there was an area in the eastern Golan Heights that was actually given back to Syria around that time in the early '70s, I think, or maybe it was in the later '70s. But anyway, I was told, as every kibbutz volunteer was told, as every traveler who had ever set foot in that part of Israel in the upper Galilee, we were told that the Syrians, between the years of 1948 and 1967, had bombarded the Israeli farmers almost every single day. And that was to help us understand why Israel, among other things, had to occupy the Golan Heights, and why Israel was victimized by its Arab neighbors, and so on and so forth. Well, I later, of course, found this out not to be, let's just say it wasn't the whole story. Let's say, as Paul Harvey would have said, there's a rest of the story, which is much more complicated in terms of the relationship between Israel and the other Arab countries from 1948 to 1967, prior to the occupation of both the West Bank and the Golan Heights and the Sinai, which was given back to Egypt in the late '70s. But just in passing, I wanted to note that Jonathan Cook, the writer who lives in Nazareth, which is a Palestinian city within Israel, has written well about this on Counterpunch during the past week as to what's going on here with the Golan Heights and with Trump's sort of go-ahead for the annexation, for the more formal annexation of the Golan Heights, and how this might be played out.
We should be clear that it's always worthwhile to look at a map when these discussions come up. The Golan Heights are referred to frequently recently because of the decision, if that's what it was, by the American government to say, oh yes, we'll give the Golan Heights to Israel.
Yeah.
It's the border area between Syria, in Syria. It's the border area with Israel, the northern border of Israel.
Yeah.
And the actual characteristics of the Golan Heights make it interesting in other ways as well. Mineral and fossil fuel deposits,
yes,
as well as its geopolitical position,
right,
so to speak, that makes it a prize that the Netanyahu government is happy to receive or to continue to control of.
as well as Israel's sort of de facto alliance with the Saudis in relation to Syria, and Israel's de facto alliance, or perhaps done with now, in relation to ISIS in Syria, or to the rebels in Syria trying to overthrow the Assad government, and the whole complicated nature of that as it's played out over the last several years, as Israel has taken in wounded ISIS soldiers and wounded Al-Qaeda soldiers of various kinds as part of its sort of geopolitical strategy to sort of intervene to a certain extent as a proxy of the United States, and as a proxy of the Saudis in Syria.
One doesn't have to be a partisan of the, in many ways, quite oppressive government of Syria in order to say that rather transparent arguments by the United States that we're still fighting terrorism in Syria, we're fighting ISIS in Syria, is in fact a cover for the American attempt to exert control over a biddable government in Damascus. This is what the U.S. wants in terms of the region as a whole, that is, governments which will cooperate with and support America's control of the the fossil fuel resources, gas and oil, in the Persian Gulf, because the U.S. knows that that's a weapon it can use against its real economic enemies, China, from China to Germany. And the rest of the world knows that too. Only in the U.S. do we obfuscate it with government assertions about how we're fighting terrorism, and that's why we've got to kill people in mosques in Syria. The question of America's control of the world oil market remains, as it has been for a long time, a matter of American foreign policy, and these days it's the basis for the insistence by the U.S. that we have a biddable government in Venezuela.
Yes.
And we're willing to kill a lot of people in order to do that, too.
Which has been complicated by the fact, just reported recently by Vijay Prashad, and I mean commented on, he didn't report on it, commented on by Vijay Prashad on the Real News Network regarding the Chinese and Russian buying Venezuelan oil, increasing their purchases of Venezuelan oil as ways of supporting the Maduro government, and how that plays into this whole scenario.
And the Russians and the Chinese, to a lesser extent, are involved here precisely because they are customers for Venezuela, and the U.S. is doing its best to strangle the Venezuelan government by cutting off its export of the great resource that Venezuela has, which is crude oil. The greatest deposits of oil in the world are in places like, say, Iraq and Venezuela and so forth. That has a certain resonance for American foreign policy in the current administrations and earlier ones, and the great crimes committed by the United States government in the 21st century. Oil is involved, and the involvement is perhaps changing. It's worthwhile paying attention to that, but for the moment at least, the U.S. is very much concerned about making sure that it controls the governments that control oil. You're watching News from Neptune. We have I want another comment about the Democratic hopefuls for the presidential nomination and the question of opposition to war. We don't really have an anti-war candidate, and that's no accident. But the closest we come, I think, is Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who I continue to find interesting, perhaps more interesting than our researcher does. J.B. Nicholson points to the Code Pink analyses of Gabbard. While most candidates shy away from foreign policy, Congressmember Gabbard has made foreign policy, particularly ending war, the centerpiece of her campaign. She was truly impressive in her March 10th CNN town hall, talking more honestly about U.S. wars than any other presidential candidate in recent history. Gabbard promises to end senseless wars. That's a strange way to put it. I mean, wars have a sense. It happens to be a vicious one, but the notion that these are sort of accidental, like tripping on the top step.
Or that we should end them because they cost too much.
Yes. Gabbard promises to end senseless wars like the one she witnessed as a National Guard officer in Iraq. She unequivocally states her opposition to U.S. regime change interventions, as well as the new Cold War at arms race with Russia, and supports rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. These are all reasonable positions. I mean, elementary, it would seem to me. Yeah. She was also an original co-sponsor to Representative Khanna's Yemen War Powers Bill, the notion that the United States is illegally supporting the Saudi devastation of Yemen. But Gabbard's actually voting record on war and peace issues, especially on military spending, is not nearly so dovish as Sanders. This is the Code Pink argument. As I say, she voted for 19 of 29 military spending bills in the last 6 years, and she's only a 51% peace action voting record. This is a group that tries to understand how the members of Congress are actually voting. Many of the votes that Peace Action counted against her were votes to fully fund controversial new weapons systems, including nuclear-tipped cruise missiles in 2014, 2015, and 2016, an 11th U.S. aircraft carrier in 2013 and 2015, and various parts of Obama's anti-ballistic missile program, which fueled the new Cold War, an arms race she now decries. Gabbard voted at least twice in 2015 and 2016 not to repeal the much-abused 2001 authorization for the use of military force, and she voted 3 times not to limit the use of Pentagon slush funds. In 2016, she voted against an amendment to cut the military budget by just 1%. Gabbard received more than $8,000 in defense industry contributions for her 2018 re-election campaign. $8,000 in a congressional election campaign, by the way, may cover the coffee bill, but still. While Obama received brief note on his drone war support, Obama's opposition to the Iraq War and vague promises for a new direction were enough to win him the presidency and the Nobel Peace Prize, but not to bring us peace. This is the two-faced Obama election campaign, which tried to take advantage of the anti-war sentiment in the U.S. in 2008, and success did. In the end, Obama spent more on the military than Bush and dropped more bombs on more countries, including a tenfold increase in CIA drone strikes. That man's a snake. There's no mention of any of the reviewed candidates' drone war support in Code Pink's list, so there's no analysis of the difference between how Gabbard is commonly billed versus her pro-drone rhetoric. Now, we might say in response that an optimist would say that Gabbard has shown an ability to learn from her earliest campaigns and the issues including but not limited to war issues, and perhaps that's a good sign there, given the fact that she is, with the possible exception of Sanders, the most progressive on war matters amongst this Democratic field, and as this Code Pink points out, that's not very progressive at all.
Yes.
Well, to continue the point, we have a couple of minutes left. We'll continue this point.
We've got about 10 minutes left, I think.
This is an interview by Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept with Gabbard. I'm wondering what your position. I know that in the past you've said you favor a small footprint approach with strike forces and limited use of weaponized drones. Is that still your position? This, by the way, this interview is from 2 years ago. Is that still your position, that you think that's to the extent that you believe the U.S. military should be used around the world for counterterrorism? Is that your position? Gabbard responded, well, when we're dealing with the unconventional threat of terrorist groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and some of these other groups that are affiliated with them, we should not be using basically what has been and continues to be the current policy of these mass mobilizations of troops, these long occupations and trillions of dollars going in, really abusing the authorization to use military force and taking action that expands far beyond the legal limitations of the current AUMFs. So with these terrorist cells, this is Tulsi Gabbard talking about the counterterrorism war policy. So with these terrorist cells, for example, yes, I do still believe that the right approach to take is these quick strike forces, surgical strikes in and out very quickly, no long-term deployment, no long-term occupation, to be able to get rid of the threat that exists and then get out, and very limited use of drones in those situations where our military is not able to get in without creating an unacceptable level of risk, and where you can make sure that you're not causing, a large amount of civilian casualties. If current policy includes really abusing the authorization of the use of military force, as Gabbard said, her twice not voting to repeal the AUMFs, and not voting to limit the use of Pentagon slush funds, as Code Pink put it, needs to be explained. I think one relevant explanation follows in the Code Pink article, and we'll put that has to do with the contributions from the defense industry. I think that may be overstated. I think it may have more to do with the attempt by Gabbard to balance the sorts of things that can be said pro and con in regard to American militarization, and that's a fairly strict standard. I'll post this interview and the other discussions of Gabbard and Sanders' tentative anti-war positions on the Facebook page for News from Neptune.
I want to say a word about Morris Dees.
Oh, good. Hey, let's go to a real villain, huh?
You know, I just can't pass this stuff up. It's too good.
It is too good.
It is too good, and it gives us a chance to quote Alexander Cockburn, the late Alexander
Which is always
Cockburn,
a good thing to do.
Who was Morris Dees was one of his bête noirs in his finest literary fashion. The New York Times reported on the ousting of Morris Dees, who's over 80. I'm not sure why he's still working there in the first place.
Hey.
But, I mean, you know, Morris Dees spent nearly half a century, what the New York Times says, Morris Dees spent nearly half a century building the Southern Poverty Law Center into one of the nation's wealthiest and best-known legal advocacy groups. He faced down the Ku Klux Klan in the 1980s and developed his organization, founded in 1971 near the church in Montgomery, where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached, into a crusading anti-hate empire dedicated to fighting extremism in the United States. But the New York Times reports, it took three reporters to write this story, but the group now finds itself beset by internal conflict. Mr. Dees has been fired, and other top executives have quit. The staff is demanding that leaders address a climate of intolerance inside its own offices. The tumult, including pointed allegations of sexual harassment and racial discrimination, comes as the center's influences surged in the Trump era. And that's an important point, because one might argue if Alexander Cockburn were to come back and people would say to him, well, haven't you been proven wrong, Alex? Trump is now president. Hate is on the rise. Right-wing hate groups are on the rise, and I don't think Alex would have any of that for one second. And I think he'd be right about that. And they talk about in this New York Times article the endowment of $471 million, an enormous amount of money. And it says that last year the center identified over 1,000 hate groups across the country. Its intelligence project, which monitors the quote-unquote radical right, has been used as a resource by law enforcement officials and the news media. Okay, that's the way the New York Times sort of covers this. What Alexander Cockburn said in April of 2009, when he was writing for the Nation, and he had already been exposing Morris Dees for many, many years, as had his colleague Ken Silverstein, who founded Counterpunch with him. Alex wrote then, 10 years ago, what is the arch salesman of hate mongering? This is, okay, this is the April of 2009. Obama has been president for 4 months, 3 months. What is the arch salesman of hate mongering, Morris Dees of the Southern Poverty Law Center, going to do now? Ever since 1971, U.S. Postal Service mail bags have bulged with his fundraising letters, scaring dollars out of the pockets of trembling liberals, aghast at his lurid depictions of hate-sodden America, in dire need of legal confrontation by the SPLC. 9 years ago, Ken Silverstein wrote 9 years ago, that would have been in the year 2000, Ken Silverstein wrote a devastating commentary on Dees and SPLC in Harper's, dissecting a typical swatch of Dees' solicitations. At the time, Ken pointed out the SPLC was, quote, the wealthiest civil rights group in America, with $120 million in assets. Now it has close to $500 million. According to recent data. A recent article in Newsweek cites the SPLC's latest year in hate report. In 2008, the number of hate groups rose to 926, up 4% from 2007, 54% from 2000. The SPLC, Cockburn writes, doesn't measure group membership, meaning they probably missed me, meaning Coburn. Change that total to 927. I'm a hate group, meaning in D speak, one with, quote, beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people, starting with Dick Cheney. And he goes on and on and on in his sort of satirical fashion. But this bringing down of Morris Dees and of the Southern Poverty Law Center is really nothing new to anybody who's been watching this for the last 20 or 25 years and reading the writing about it. But it is, to a certain extent, satisfying. And again, it does nothing to debunk the current anti-Trumpism, the current concern with hate groups, doesn't do anything to debunk any of the criticisms that Silverstein and Coburn and Jeffrey St. Clair and others have been offering the SPLC over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years.
Finally, what can we conclude about the utter and total failure of the Russiagate investigation to find any evidence of Russian collusion? We can conclude that it was a hoax cooked up by an utterly corrupt and immoral military security complex determined to protect its $1,000 billion annual budget and the power that goes with it from the loss of its Russian enemy to normalized relations. That's what Trump threatened. He was going to make friends with Russia, remember, from the campaign? And therefore he had to be a Manchurian candidate. We can conclude that Hillary's Democratic National Committee was partner to this crime, and that scum like Gerald Nadler and Adam Schiff, congresspeople, have destroyed the reputation and credibility of the Democratic Party. That's assuming it had one. We can conclude that the U.S. media is devoid of all integrity, morality, and truthfulness, and has forever discredited itself as a source of objective and accurate information. That's why we're News from Neptune. We can conclude that the corrupt military security complex and Democratic Party were so determined to serve their own narrow self-interest that they're willing to subject the entirety of the world to a higher risk of nuclear war. We can conclude that the fact that such filth as Mueller, Brennan, Comey, Rosenstein, and Clapper were at the top of U.S. intelligence and criminal investigation is a conclusive proof that the U.S. government is a criminal organization. Keep in mind, as Tucker Carlson, of all people, reminds us, that Mueller's investigation was not a well-intentioned investigation conducted by open-minded people who turned out to be wrong. It was an organized witch hunt event determined to destroy the President of the United States. What will be the consequences of this failed act of high treason, perhaps pressing it a bit, on the part of the Democratic Party, military security complex, and prostitutes in the media to falsely convict the duly elected President of the United States and remove him from office? Will President Trump be content with his enemies' failure and move on, or will he hold them responsible for their criminal actions? Keep in mind that Mueller's investigation was based on spy warrants obtained by deceiving the FISA court, which is a felony. Keep in mind that Mueller's indictments of Manafort and Stone were far outside the designated scope of his investigation and have nothing whatsoever to do with Russiagate. This makes the convictions of Manafort and Stone illegitimate, by the way. Where is Trump's pardon of these illegitimately convicted Republicans? If Trump fails, we're running out of time, and this is the point that I am quoting from here, or the article I'm quoting from here is from Paul Craig Roberts. I'll place this on the Facebook page of News from Neptune, along with the other things we've mentioned this evening. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 13th week of 2019, what did I say? Boys of Summer edition.
Oh, yeah.
As the U.S. political establishment moves to overthrow by coups the elected presidents of Venezuela and the U.S., as Presidents Maduro and Trump threaten to inhibit the economic dominance secured by violence of the U.S. 1%. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Crofton Coleman with Andrew Scolleray. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.